Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope the sound and vision is clear and working, but welcome, everyone. I understand that up to 270 people have joined this webinar. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As chair of the European Network of National Independent Fiscal Institutions, I want to welcome you to this webinar. Our webinar on the Economic Governance Review. What rules for the post-pandemic environment? In this webinar, a paper of the network will be presented and be discussed. This paper is written on the basis of the expertise and experiences of the national IFIs. And this paper focuses in particular on the role that IFIs can play in future economic governance of the fiscal framework of the European Union. This webinar is organized in collaboration with the SEPS Institute. On behalf of the network, I'd like to express my gratitude to SEPS. The network's deputy chair, Sebastian Barnes, will present the paper. I am pleased that two renowned speakers are willing to take part on the panel in the discussion of the paper. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, former chair of the Eurogroup, and Xavier Debrun, member of the European Fiscal Board. Welcome to you both and many thanks on beforehand for your participation. Finally, I would like to welcome Mrs. Cynthia Alcidi, Director of Research at SEPS. She will moderate this webinar and the panel discussion. Now I give the floor to her. Cynthia, over to you.
Many thanks, Richard. And let me say that it's a pleasure to be in this webinar, and also a pleasure to cooperate with the network and to also the secretariat of the network. SEPS is playing this role in the last 2 years. I think it's a great opportunity for discussion, debate, and cooperation, and I think this webinar is really an example. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sebastian for the presentation of the paper.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. So thanks very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to this contribution from EU IFIs to the EU Fiscal and Economic Governance Review and discussion. 2 seconds. So, by way of background, national independent fiscal institutions, IFIs, are independent official bodies with mandates to monitor and assess different aspects of the public finances. When the Commission launched its review of the Economic and Governance Framework in October, it announced its intention to consult the IFIs, and that discussion will be happening in a few weeks' time. As Richard said, the network of IFIs is an independent group of these national IFIs, some 32 of them, that provides a platform to work together in various areas of mutual interest. And this paper, this contribution that we're discussing, was prepared by the Secretariat of the network, an ad hoc working group, and was discussed by the network more widely. The paper is published under the responsibility of the leadership of the network. It doesn't necessarily represent the views of each institution individually. But let me take just a moment to thank actually everyone from the network who's contributed to this. It's been a fantastic effort, and particularly from our Secretariat and Ina Olinik. So how can IFIs strengthen fiscal governance, and what kind of role do they play? Well, there's been quite a lot of evidence of this looking at different IFIs, and some of the main conclusions are that IFIs help to produce more accurate and less biased economic and fiscal forecasts, obviously very important input to good fiscal governance. IFIs can improve compliance with fiscal rules by improving monitoring and transparency. And IFIs can also more generally help to make the case for sound fiscal policies and contribute to deficit reduction. And one of the great characteristics of the IFIs is an ability really to engage with national circumstances, both in terms of the analysis, but also to engage with the public and the wider political process, including through the media. So what do the IFIs bring to this debate? Well, IFIs have substantial expertise and experience in fiscal policy in all the countries of the EU, but also more specifically in the application of the EU fiscal rules. This is an area where IFIs are very active. And so this paper draws on those experiences, on knowledge of national conditions and our economic expertise, hopefully as a useful contribution to the wider debate, and hopefully we bring a different perspective. This paper is very much focused on the EU fiscal framework. We recognize there are a lot of wider issues around the governance, but these are essentially political and beyond our mandates as IFIs. So it's not that they're unimportant, it's just they're beyond the scope of what we can discuss. So let me turn to the key messages. Overall, the current EU governance framework has obviously brought many advantages, but it suffers from weak compliance, pro-cyclicality, and excessive complexity. One important step in any reform will be to make sure that the framework from 2023 is clarified once the general escape clause has ended. So that will be an important first step. But turning to the future, there are really three areas that this contribution focuses on. The first is the rules, the second is the role of IFIs, and the third is the role of data and statistics. In terms of the rules, a simple, transparent, multi-year approach to enforceable numerical fiscal rules should be should be prioritized. The focus should be narrowed to fewer numerical rules, while detailed implementation of those rules should be streamlined. So this is under the heading of simplicity. In terms of IFIs, the role of national IFIs in supporting sound fiscal policy at the EU level should be enhanced. National IFIs are well placed to carry out assessments of fiscal developments and sustainability at national level. There should be an obligation on the EU institutions to take these assessments into account. At the same time, national IFIs should retain their independence. They should also receive timely access to information and have the resources necessary to play this role. The effective functioning of IFI should therefore be supported by a sort of framework for minimum national standards in EU member states. And in some cases, this may require a broadening or a strengthening of national IFI mandates. And in terms of statistics, fiscal rules should be supported by better data and other information. If we take a step back and see what leads us to this conclusion in terms of the network's contribution, there are a number of challenges to the current framework. While the fiscal support during the pandemic for the economy has been absolutely essential, has been something that IFIs have supported and helped to think about, there will ultimately be a need to ensure that debt ratios in many countries are reduced over time to safer levels, despite lower interest rates. And you can see from this chart, based on projections, that almost half of the EU member states are projected to have debt that's over the 60% threshold once we emerge from the crisis, hopefully. There's also a need to address longer-term challenges, such as lower productivity, and to achieve climate change and social objectives. And that includes through public investment. And so if you look here, we see two of the challenges. One is the growing pensions expenditure as the population ages, and the other is the fact that many member states still have quite a long way to go in terms of achieving the energy consumption reductions they need to address climate change objectives. So this is a very challenging environment as we exit the crisis. And in that context, national fiscal policy should continue to ensure long-run fiscal sustainability while pursuing appropriate counter-cyclical policies and contributing to sustainable growth, social and climate objectives. While experience differs widely across countries and the EU fiscal rules have undoubtedly brought many benefits, we do also see weak outcomes in many countries. Debt ratios have been rising in recent decades despite declining interest rates. Long-term fiscal pressures have increased, and there has been a failure to run appropriate counter-cyclical policies, both in terms of supporting the economy in bad times, but also, and perhaps more subtly, saving sufficiently during economic recoveries. And as many others have noted, we share the assessment that the current fiscal framework really suffers from three main interrelated problems. One is weaknesses in compliance. The second is pro-cyclicality, which sometimes encourages countries to move policy in the wrong way. And of course, excessive complexity. The approach advocated in this contribution from the network is based on three pillars. The first is continued reliance on numerical fiscal rules. There's a wider view within the network that numerical fiscal rules remain very important. The second is an enhanced role for IFIs in the context of EU surveillance. Within the network, there are many that see that our view is not adequately used, or more could be made of it at the European level, and of course, improved data and other information. Now, one aspect that's important, as I noted earlier, is the new governance framework, or some plan needs to be in place by 2023. A prolonged period of sort of discretionary policy where the rules aren't very clear could make it very difficult to return to a solid framework afterwards. And we've already seen evidence of some countries making quite big permanent increases during the COVID period. And there's a risk that countries will use any slack in the system essentially to make the wrong kinds of decisions. Turning to the first of those pillars, which is the fiscal rules, the network does not take a position on the exact design of EU fiscal rules. This is a very complicated problem. Many countries in very different situations, there's a big debate about how the rules should be designed. So the network doesn't really take a sort of position on its preferred model. Rather, what we do in the contribution is we set out some of the things that we think should be taken into account in the design of those rules. And so we think, firstly, that numerical rules should remain a core part of the overall framework, but they need to be better designed. And that means they need to be simpler, they need to be more transparent, they need to be less pro-cyclical, and they need to be genuinely multi-annual. And if we look at the proposals that we've seen, we basically see that there are two main approaches that have been proposed to reforming the rules. As I said, we're not taking a view between these two approaches. One is a debt anchor and then an expenditure ceiling to operationalize that. The other is some modification of the existing EU SGP framework. In theory, you might think that the two main approaches can be somewhat similar and could be constructed in ways to generate similar outcomes. But in practice, there may be important advantages and disadvantages to how each functions. And this depends very much on specific features of their design and their implementation. And this is a lot of what our contribution is looking at. Now, maybe these high-level design choices aren't as important as actually getting the details right. So this is one way of thinking about the equivalence of those two rules. So we have a high-level goal in terms of fiscal sustainability and economic stabilization. You can either achieve that through a debt reduction target. Perhaps you set the debt reduction by formula, perhaps you set it politically. On the other side, you have an expenditure benchmark type rule, but it's based on the MTO, which is a structural balance concept, but also takes into account the level of debt. And all of these can be operationalized essentially through a multi-year expenditure ceiling. So the question is really how you set those requirements for the spending ceiling and how the spending ceiling is designed. But there's a strong view, I think, among members of the network that well-designed multi-year expenditure ceilings can be very effective as an operational requirement to achieve the fiscal policy objectives. And there are a number of design issues that need to be considered, and these are set out in more detail in the contribution. The first is to have a genuinely multi-annual framework. So, for example, one of the weaknesses of the expenditure benchmark is even with averaging and things, the expenditure benchmark gets reset every year and can move quite a lot. So it's not really setting a very firm medium-term anchor, it's one that's moving around. Then there's a question of how that measure of spending is defined, the use of a modified measure. There should be greater harmonization probably here, and also how tax and discretionary measures are factored in. So there's a number of quite technical issues there. And a third set of issues is whether you should be able to deviate from the rule. For example, an adjustment margin for overruns or a rainy day fund. There's a case to be made for these. We don't take a view either way as to whether that should be used, but if these kind of features are built in, they need to be subject to strong oversight, and that includes a strong role for IFIs as to whether any deviations are really justified. In terms of reducing complexity, which is the kind of holy grail of EU reform, this is the thing everyone wants from changing the rules. We think that there are really three pillars here. Again, one, the number of rules that are the subject of enforcement should be reduced. Now that could be achieved by reducing the number of rules or just focusing more on some of them, but that would help to simplify the framework that's characterized at the moment by many different rules. The second is to streamline, simplify, strengthen the interpretation of the rules. So often the way the rules are applied or some of the details around them can add hugely to the complexity. So for example, in the areas of the investment structural reform clauses, it could be that some of the numerical criteria could be downplayed with more of a focus on an economic assessment of really what's going on. Some of the key concepts, such as discretionary revenue measures, one-off structural balances, could be set out more clearly by way of principles and with examples, without necessarily trying to use the rules to cover every single possible contingency that might happen, which makes the rules very complex and might not even properly catch the situations that can actually arise. The single escape clause could also be used as a way of simplifying that part of the network. And the other part of reducing this complexity might be to rely less on the details of the rules and more on compliance by IFIs. And we'll go on to that a little bit more later. There are two other issues that I think are worth pointing out in the contribution around the rules. Firstly is the treatment of investment. There's quite a long discussion there. We think that investment may warrant special treatment and recognition in the design of rules, but there are advantages and drawbacks to how this is done, and it needs to be done very carefully and well designed. I think sometimes the discussion here, there's a strong desire for higher public investment, and sometimes the proposals are rather simple, and I think would break down in practice. There's a lot of complicated issues to be faced here, and a careful balance needs to be struck. The other point is that rules should be tested prior to their implementation. Sometimes in the past, rules have just been implemented without really doing any sort of back testing or looking at how they might play out when you run the forecast through them. And that's led to design problems with the rules. So I think it's essential that these kinds of rules have been tested. The EFB has done some nice examples. It's quite difficult because the country's just so different. And I think that's one of the things that sound testing would reveal. Can people still hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're back.
Good. Okay, I don't know whether I lost you or you lost me, but it sounds probably like me. Can you see my screen?
No.
No.
Okay. Bea, I think I've been sort of thrown out as a panelist, so I can't start my video or share the screen. Sorry about this, everyone.
Sebastian,
No,
I don't know.
you're a panelist still.
Okay.
Okay, try again.
I think there was a problem of connection on my side. I don't know whether it was from everyone from SEPS.
Okay.
I lost connection.
Okay, I can't start my video because host
Neither
stopped it.
I can.
Okay. Can you try again?
I'll try again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm here, and I will share my screen again. Okay, sorry about that. Everything okay for everyone?
Yeah, I think the session was completely restarted. Huh? I think Zoom crashed.
Okay, are all the participants back, which is probably the most important thing?
Yes, we have 170.
Cool, perfect. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. Obviously, someone doesn't want the role of IFIs to be enhanced. I will let you guess who that might be. Maybe a subject for the panel. Okay, so sorry about that. Life and IFIs sometimes is a bit like that. The role. So one of the contributions of this paper is the view that more could be made of the role of IFIs. We think we bring a detailed, objective understanding of national circumstances. We have a wide variety of roles in forecasting and analysis and wider assessment of policies. And we discussed at the beginning, there are many studies that point to the positive impacts. On the right-hand side, you'll just see some of the recent work done by IFIs. If you go to our website, you'll see a lot of the best of things that are coming out as national IFIs. As we said at the beginning, IFIs really can make a strong contribution both on the forecasting side in terms of improving compliance with the rules, through improving monitoring and transparency, through general promotion of sound policies, and also with the ability to engage with the national political system and the national media. And I think that's a unique advantage that IFIs have, both the understanding of the countries and the ability to engage with the system while being independent and objective at the same time. So in terms of strengthening the role at the EU level, where we think that this role of the IFIs could be stronger, essentially this comes down to the requirement that the EU institution should take into account assessments from the IFIs. Now, in some ways, we know that they do already. We know the Commission looks very carefully at what the IFIs do, but we think moving it to becoming an obligation, a requirement, would raise the status and role of these kinds of assessments. And we see three areas where that could be the case. The first is in terms of there are some of the national rules mirror the EU rules. So in that case, it would clearly make sense to look more carefully at what the IFIs are saying in terms of compliance. The second is there's a lot of specific, really detailed, complicated issues that are going on in countries with one-offs, discretionary revenue measures, the measurement of potential, many of these things that require quite fine judgments and knowledge about what's going on. And here we think the opinion of the IFIs could be very helpful to providing an objective understanding of what's happening in the country. And the third is a more sort of catch-all assessment of fiscal sustainability and the overall fiscal position. Ultimately, when the EU institutions are looking at whether a country is compliant or not, leaving aside the rules and all these things is very important. It's also just good to have the sense as to whether policy is on the right track or not. And I think the IFIs could be producing that kind of analysis in a way that would contribute to the wider debate. Of course, EU institutions have to remain responsible for their own decisions. So this is just an input. And it's also important that national IFIs retain their independence from the Commission, from European politics, and also have their own roles. So there's a delicate balancing act to be struck here, but we do think that it would be helpful to have this requirement that the EU level should look at what's coming out of the national level. And from the IFI's perspective, this has caused trouble in the past, in the sense that sometimes, I know in the case of Ireland, we've had cases where we've had the national IFIs had concerns, the Irish Fiscal Councils had concerns about policy. The Commission has said it's fine, and the national government has said, the Commission says it's fine, so it's fine. And I think that undermines a little bit the weaknesses. So it'd be good to get these two levels essentially working together in a more structured way. For the IFIs to be able to play that role, there is going to have to be some strengthening of them. And I think setting minimal institutional requirements for the IFIs would be very helpful. In fact, many of the IFIs owe their existence to European requirements. There's a number of pieces of legislation where it's sort of mentioned that you need an independent fiscal institution, but it's not really laid out in one place. And there aren't really clear requirements or definitions as to what that is. In terms of the areas where kind of setting a minimum standard would be very helpful, one is in terms of the mandate to address the government, parliament, to publish their assessments. Good and timely access to information is very important, both vis-a-vis national governments, but also in terms of some of the decisions being taken by the Commission. Effective implementation of the comply or explain principle would help. An adequate level of resources, management flexibility is really key, and in some countries that's lacking, and sufficient safeguards to political pressure. So there's a lot that you could do to consolidate what is good practice amongst many of the IFIs in many countries. The third pillar and the final aspect is data and other information. So one of the, I think, sort of often unsung but important aspects of what the European Fiscal Rules have done is actually requiring a lot more statistics and data to be provided. And that's essential for setting policy in a good way and for transparency. But there are some more steps that can be taken. One would be requiring member states to produce credible medium-term projections covering at least 4 years in all official macro financial documents. This is not what's done in a lot of countries, and this is one of the things that undermines a good medium-term orientation to policy. There's a lot of issues around simplification, transparency, and methodological improvements in assessment of potential output gap measures. This has been one of the places where procyclicality has come. It's not an easy problem to solve, and if the rules put less emphasis on it, it'll be less important, but you still ultimately need a good view of where the economy is heading in the medium term and what the cyclical position is. So this does more work. An improved treatment of one-off measures and clearer guidance would be helpful, and the same is true for the measurement of discretionary revenue measures, where there could again be better information and better standards could be provided. There's also a number of other issues here. I think it's probably more minor in a sense, but a number of other detailed aspects and statistics that would be helpful in terms of financing needs, in terms of balance sheets, in terms of debt sustainability analysis that would all help to improve the understanding of fiscal policy. These aren't currently requirements, and we think these will be very helpful. So let me just leave you with the key messages. As we said, there are a number of fiscal challenges coming ahead. There are a number of shortcomings in the current framework. As a first step, what's really important is to clarify and to have a proper framework in place from 2023. This isn't an issue that should be allowed to run a long time. Beyond that, that will create ambiguity and potentially difficulties. There are three main pillars in this contribution: rules, the role of IFIs, and statistics. The rules basically need to become simpler, multi-year, more enforceable, and potentially have fewer rules that are actively enforced. In terms of the IFIs, we think they have a lot to contribute and their role could be better used. In particular, there should be an obligation on the EU institutions to take these assessments into account as an input. And part of that would also be ensuring that there are minimum standards, that all IFIs have the resources and the powers they need to play an effective role. And finally, fiscal rules would be supported by better data and other information. It's a very rich report. I know there was a lot of material in that presentation as well. As I said, a lot of the detail is important, so I'd encourage you actually to read it. I think the IFIs have a lot of wisdom. We've tried to reflect that as much as possible in the contribution. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Sebastian, for this very rich presentation. Indeed, there are quite a lot of issues, and I'm sure there are quite a lot of questions. I would like to invite all the participants to ask questions by using the Q&A function. Everyone can find it at the bottom of the screen. Please type in questions, preferably short questions, so that we can then try to respond to them. In the meantime, I would like to give the floor to Jeroen to maybe react to the presentation of Sebastian's, maybe cherry pick some of the points he presented, but also to more broadly share your thoughts on this issue of basically how to make, in fact, the rules and the fiscal framework work well. I would put it this way. Jeroen, the floor is yours.
There you go. Thank you, Cynthia. And thanks to Sebastian for the paper and his introduction. I think it's very good, and it addresses a topic which is not being given enough attention. So in the whole debate about fiscal rules, the soundness of how we actually come to these rules, where we get the data from the institutional side, is getting too little attention. So I'm very happy that in this paper, you really look at the soundness of the whole procedure and the institutional side. Quite rightly, you point out three issues, and I think in general, everyone could agree that the rules are complex, the level of compliance is problematic, and there is pro-cyclicality in how it works out. But having said that, immediately the debate starts, because some people will say that the complexity follows from the lack of compliance, and other people will say it's the other way around. I can remember that it was so difficult to comply to the rules, certainly in the financial crisis and the euro crisis, that we added layer upon layer of flexibility to at least try and keep some countries close to the rules. So then flexibility, which means complexity, was added to improve compliance. So the relation between these is very complex. And if you look at the current situation, many people say the differences between our member states are so big now. For example, the Netherlands still has a sovereign debt below 60%, and Italy is close to 150%. How can we have one set of rules for such different situations? But if you say that, then immediately comes in complexity, because you will start distinguishing between countries and different situations. Or when you look at climate change, if you want to treat investments related to climate change differently, immediately you will add complexity, because who's going to define what is an investment, what is a sound investment? How do they come up in your fiscal or in your budgets? So complexity is always a result from a lot of political contradictory wishes. And I think complexity will stay with us, though I share your wish to make it less complex. Having said that, I would like to add one more problem of the current rules in the current framework, and that is predictability. I can remember that because the structural deficit played such a big role, and the Commission did their assessments twice a year, the assessment of where you are in your fiscal situation could change every 6 months. The structural deficit, you would expect it to be quite stable because it's a long-term objective, but in fact, due to the method, it was far from stable. And every time when you thought, okay, I'm within the rules again, the next time the Commission looked, the structural deficit would be changed. And all of a sudden you were in a different situation again and you needed to do more adjustments. So predictability for policy making is also very important. If you can't predict where you are, then it's very difficult to set out your fiscal policy. I'd like to focus in the rest of my time on the integrity of the process. And this is quite an issue because not only is the economics of our fiscal framework debated, also the credibility, the public trust, perhaps even also the political trust, the trust between countries. And I think this deserves a lot of attention. So this is about, can we trust the data? Can we trust each other's data? Can we trust the forecasts? How sound are they? How objectively are they made? And can we trust the budget? The budget forecasts, are the figures in there realistic, etc. And this is the basis, because if all those three are flawed or politicized, already we are in trouble. And here, of course, the role of the national independent fiscal institutions is crucial. So I very much agree with having proper quality standards for the national fiscal institutions to establish that the data, the forecasts, and the budget is sound. And then you can have a proper political debate about what does this mean, how do we assess it, how should it be implemented, etc. But first of all, we need to get the base right. For the position of the national fiscal institutions to be strengthened, I think we really need Brussels, we really need the Commission, for perhaps the formal reason that it would be useful to have more precise European standards laid down in legislation, which would support the position of the fiscal institutions in their home country. But also, if the Commission takes the assessments by the IFIs very seriously, actually takes it as a starting point for its own assessment, then that will immediately strengthen the position of the IFIs. They will be taken serious if the Commission takes them serious. So the role of the Commission in strengthening the IFIs and giving them that role to look at data, forecasts, and budgets is very, very important. Also, the role of the Commission is crucial, of course. I can remember things changed between the Commission of Barroso and the Commission of Juncker. Jean-Claude Juncker used to say, this is a political commission, which I personally think is fine, because you have to make political judgments and you are under democratic control, so that's fine. But you have to ask yourself the question, what is it you want to politicize? I would hope not the data, not the methods, not the macroeconomic forecasts. And then, yes, you can make a political call whether you will accept some deviation of the rules. You can make a political call, how much time do you want a country to have to become compliant again, you can make a political call whether there should be sanctioning and what that sanction would look like, etc. But I'm very critical about what the Commission has done in allowing the statistics and the forecasts to become politicized. So I've pleaded before for a independent part of the Commission, or even perhaps outside the Commission, a bureau which would establish the facts and do objective forecasts, and then the Commission can take their political decisions on those objective data methods forecasts. And I think those separating what is political and what should not be political is a very important element in rebuilding trust. It's not just about trust, therefore, in do countries want to comply or not. It's also trust in the process in which the Commission plays such a central role. And that needs to be strengthened in my mind. Finally, the Commission has a lot of discretionary powers in the current framework, and I think that's right. But I have a couple of concerns there. One is that if the rules allow for a lot of flexibility, and on top of that there is discretionary power, and the Commission makes a lot of use of that discretionary power, then basically anything goes. And that is not helpful for building trust in the framework. So either we have more clear, simple rules which will work out, which have, of course, the risk that they work out in a much too harsh way because they are simple and straightforward and they don't allow for a lot of flexibility. Then I would like to have a lot of discretionary power for the Commission. But if we maintain to have rules with lots of flexibility, allowing different treatment for different countries, then I would object to having on top of that also discretionary power for the Commission. And that's basically what we have now. And I can tell you that the remark that the President of the Commission once made when he visited Paris, and he was asked about the fiscal compliance of the French government, and he said, well, it's France, or words of the same effect. The effect of that in some of the smaller countries in the Eurozone was not very positive. So discretionary power is useful and it is necessary. If we go to much simpler, straightforward rules, then you will need to have discretionary power, but the Commission needs to use it in a transparent way, treating different countries in the same position, also in the same way. So transparency is also important when you look at the discretionary power of the Commission. Let me check my time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeroen. I think you gave us quite a few very clear messages. I would like now to move to Xavier Debrun. Xavier is member of the European Fiscal Board, but in his previous position at the IMF has worked a lot on fiscal issues and also on independent fiscal institutions. So we would like to hear your thoughts and your reaction to Sebastian. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Cinzia, for this introduction. Indeed, you just reminded me that the first time we pushed for a paper in the IMF board on what we used to call independent fiscal agencies at the time was exactly to the day 16 years. So since then, I think we've made some progress, and I'm very happy I'm very happy about that. So I will go straight to a few reactions about the networks paper, which I really found excellent and thoughtful. And then I will conclude with my New Year wishes, since we're close to the New Year. First, I think that in the current environment, it's useful to remind ourselves why we need fiscal rules. And we need fiscal rules because this currency union is incomplete. we miss a single treasury issuing safe assets. So we must do as if we had that single treasury. Of course, if you want to fake it, you have two ways to do it in this context. The first way you can fake it is to ask the euro system to kindly backstop all public debts. This is effectively what is happening now, but this is in the specific context of this pandemic. The second way you can fake it is by asking all the members of the Euro Club to keep their fiscal house in order. Indeed, as we remember from 2009, the failure by a single member state to be fiscally responsible carries an existential risk for the entire union. So the objective must be clear. The rules must cement debt sustainability in every corner of the monetary union. And attempts to bend the rules in ways that incentivize other objectives like sufficient public investment, greening the economy, or whatever good thing the government could do under the sun must be made without prejudice of that sustainability. So there is a clear lexicographic ordering of priorities behind any fiscal rule here. And the first is, of course, debt sustainability. The second thing I want to say is, okay, what's wrong with the SGP? And there the paper is very clear. I broadly share the analysis. The pact is too complicated, it's not enforced, and it leaves room for pro-cyclicality in good times, which is the way economists say that governments fail to fix the roof when the sun is shining. In fact, the pact is too complicated precisely, and I think Jeroen was very clear in expressing this. The pact is too complicated because one has tried to make it more contingent while at the same time keeping it enforceable. And therefore, each time you add a contingency, you need to plug that contingency to avoid that disingenuous government exploit the loopholes created by the contingency. So in the end, I think the core issue is the enforceability of the entire framework. You could also interpret this in terms of what Jeroen said, which is to restore the trust in the framework. Now, what can independent fiscal institutions do to help? First, there is one thing they cannot do, which is to become an explicit veto player in the budget process or come across as trying to be a veto player in the budget process. This would mean plunging into the political fray and would expose IFIs to a material risk of being pressured, politicized, or effectively disabled through resource starvation. We've seen that in the past. But what IFIs can do is to grease the wheels of democratic accountability. And they do so, as the paper explained, by raising transparency, by exposing tricks to evade the rules. This has to do in part with the forecasts that sometimes are politicized. It can do so by raising the reputational cost of major policy mistakes that threaten the sustainability of public finances. And hopefully IFIs can also strengthen the quality overall, the overall quality of the public debate on public finances. I'm always flabbergasted to see the poor quality of the public debates in the press, for instance, on fiscal matters. So before concluding on what I'd like to see in 2022 and beyond, let me cherry pick a few points addressed in the paper. First of all, I would like to say that I fully agree with the need for a much simpler Stability and Growth Pact, which is unambiguously anchored in debt sustainability. I hope we will all agree that there is no magic number for debt, and that 60% is a pipe dream for many countries today. So I suggest giving the 60% the status of a sacred relic or a voodoo doll, as you wish, but only to avoid changing the treaties. Encouraging debt should be country-specific. There is nothing wrong with that, because debt sustainability is the directional concept. It's about how debt evolves over time, and we hope it goes back to more reasonable levels, but it's not and should not be an exercise in numerology. The second point I want to make is that the true operational and binding constraint for fiscal policy should be framed in terms of expenditure growth, and I mean total expenditure growth. Remember that we have a debt problem rooted in an expenditure problem. And I love the medium-term focus because this is exactly what debt ceilings can give you. They always have to be meaningful, this medium-term orientation. And this is exactly what can solve one of the big issues with the SGP, which is the lack of symmetric counter-cyclicality. So expenditure rules over the medium terms, yes, can give you this counter-cyclicality in a symmetric fashion, and you do not have to deal with the insanity of having to pin down the output gap in real times. The third point I want to make is that investment needs no protection from a fiscal rule. Investment needs protection from politicians. So policymakers cutting investment to comply with the rules shoot themselves in the foot. And here, IFIs should be those exposing the morphing of fiscal irresponsibility from borrowing too much to investing too little. In both cases, policymakers escape their responsibility by accumulating debt, except that the debt created by underinvestment is hidden until you hit a pothole. Fourth, I largely agree with the paper's reminder about the role of IFIs in the fiscal framework. I have just two issues I want all of us to keep in mind here. The first is that EU IFIs remain quite heterogeneous. Some are obviously much closer to the efficiency or best practice border than others. The second element I want to make is that about the coordination among IFIs and between IFIs and what I will call the center, the Commission, the Council, whatever you want to call it. The paper suggests that the center should must take into account national IFIs assessment. I understand the motivation, but here I'm a bit unclear and I'm a bit afraid actually that national IFIs remain actually currently too heterogeneous to be treated as all equally safe from resource starvation and political interference. In addition, giving national IFIs such influence, apparent or real, on the center might put those more fragile IFIs with the least protection against political interference under intense political pressure. So it could be counterproductive. So now, in 2010, I drafted a paper as background for the IMF Article 4 consultation with the euro area. And there I suggested to solve these kind of coordination problems by emulating the euro system and build a European system of fiscal councils, as I called it at the time. And I still think that such a construct could ultimately contribute to make the monetary union a little bit less incomplete and to foster synergies between the jobs of IFIs and the job of the Commission. I believe it would also address in part the issue of trust that was so nicely framed by Jeroen Dijsselbloem. So what would I want to see in 2022? And then I will stop. I would love to see, obviously, and this is entirely preaching for my chapel, the SGP reformed along the lines of the recent EFB proposals, perhaps even simpler, because I still think we're too complicated. But that will not happen for reasons that are discussed in the latest EFB annual report, which I also invite you to read because it's very nicely done. Yes, I can make some advertising, okay? So what I personally hope to see is, that experts' convergence on some broad principles. I think we see today some broad convergence on the idea of having three pillars: one debt anchor, one operational spending rule, and one escape clause. I would hope to see that, gel at some point and hopefully truly inform and guide the future debate on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, which is much needed and quite urgent. So let's hope that the political stars will align in 2022 and that we will have a new baby by the end of next year. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Xavier, for this excellent presentation. I would like to give back the floor to Sebastian to react to some of the comments.
So thanks very much, Cynthia. Actually, thanks to Haroon and to Xavier for their excellent comments. I think there's a really strong level of agreement, so my comments can be quite short, and I think they've actually brought out very well, actually, some of the issues that we deal with in the paper. I think if you step back from it, you also appreciate the complexity and how much some of the details and the texture of this really matters. I think this point about the contingent nature and enforceability, there's also this sort of flexibility and enforceability. I think it's also rules versus discretion idea. Getting that balance right is very important. That's something we sort of address in the paper, but it's very hard to come to a very simple answer to it. I think Xavier was right at the end that, today the IFIs, there are some are very long established institutions. Some of them have very strong institutional frameworks, some of them don't. And I think that's why it's important to think about the two aspects of what we're proposing, both to increase the role of IFIs, because I think we've got a lot to bring and we could bring a lot more, but also making sure there's enough protections that all IFIs can fulfill that role. And I think sometimes some of the sort of discussion you hear around about strengthening the role of IFIs is a little bit simplistic, actually. I think, just give them a bigger role. I think they're not. We need more protection to be able to do that. Now, there's a balance. I think it shouldn't look like this is being imposed from the centre. I mean, in Ireland, we still get, every time someone talks about the Fiscal Council, they say that it was set up during the IMF programme, which doesn't really enhance our credibility very much. Now, I think most people have kind of move beyond that, but lazy journalists still type that in, and it's not very helpful. So I think there's a balance to be struck, but I think when it comes to these minimum standards, I think that is something that can usefully come from the centre, and I think we all benefit from the fact that there are stronger institutions in other countries. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Many thanks. There are quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. Maybe I just start with the first one we received, and it's linked to a point that Xavier made about resource starvation. And there is a question about actually the current resources available to national IFIs are insufficient. We also hear that there is quite a lot of heterogeneity across national institutions. Anyone would like to make a comment or react to this?
So I'd be happy to jump in. I think it's a good question. And it depends a lot on the country. I think there is a perception overall that IFIs are pretty small and maybe not such important institutions. But if you look at it collectively, there are a huge number of very good economists working for IFIs now, and that's what we bring together in the EU IFI network. So there is a lot of strength and capacity there, but there are gaps. There are countries where it's pretty thin. And there are two issues really. One is the level of resources, and the second is the way it's protected from political interference. And I think there's a lot of cases where more needs to be done on both. And I think one other observation is that in some countries, I think there's more of a genuine commitment from society or the political system to the IFI. There are others where they had to set it up because they had to under EU legislation, and it's not taken as seriously. Now, I think, as Haroon said, if you gave it more of a European mandate, people would take it more seriously. But I also think that if you have a well-defined mandate and a sufficient budget, most IFIs will impose themselves within the system and find their place. But if you don't give it either of those two legs, it's very hard for the IFI really to make much progress. So I think it's very important to address this, both so that we can have the staffing that we need, but also to set IFIs on the route of becoming proper, meaningful institutions within the political system.
Maybe a follow-up question, because there is another one asking whether, when proposing the broadening of the role of the IFIs, this should include also specific macrofiscal numbers. So the ability to produce, sorry, I lost the question, to produce own macrofiscal numbers, so projections, or should remain limited, as it is the case, to basically checking and supporting, in the case of positive assessment, forecasts produced by the government.
So just my view on this, so we don't particularly take a view on this paper. I think it's one of the big contributions that the IFIs can make, both on the macro side and actually on the fiscal side, is making sure that the projections are good. I think that's a good basis for enforcing the rules, but also for thinking about policy. We don't particularly take a view on this. There are some countries where the IFI does make the forecast, though not many. And then there are various ways of checking it. Some of them, like we basically do a parallel exercise, other ones do more limited exercise. But I think it's one of those things that depends a lot on the national circumstances. There are some countries that have a long problem with bias in forecasts. There are others that don't. In Ireland, bias isn't particularly a problem. Making an accurate forecast is virtually impossible, but the bias isn't particularly a problem. But there have been there have been some issues which are very prominent in some countries and not in others. So I think there is some scope, I think, to take into account what's actually useful to do at a national level.
Thanks. Jeroen, would you like to add on this point?
No, I think, I see it as part of nation building. So I still see the whole European project as a project of nation building. And one of the key elements to strengthen what we have is to build good institutions. And IFIs need more of our attention. And I think that having a sound European legal framework for their position more detailed in how they should be equipped, financed, what their independent position is, what their role is, and what they should be able to do, I think will be very useful. I don't know whether in the current situation, the IFIs visit each other to compare and establish standards of the quality of work. I think the Commission should enhance that. I mean, this is a very common method to improve the quality of institutions, yes, is to have an evaluation framework in which horizontally institutions visit each other and criticize or advise each other. My summary would be that in order to lift it to the next level, I think the European Commission needs to understand the importance that the IFIs can and should have. But I agree with Xavier that we need to lift them all up to a good level before they can take that very important role. And the Commission really needs to take an initiative in that, because some of the national member states don't really see the use of it. On the contrary, I would say.
Thanks. Maybe another question, which is touches upon a point which I think all of you mentioned in your first intervention, which is about the fact that countries in the European Union have very different levels of debt. Now, should there be different rules, given that countries have such largely different level of debt?
I think even with having one rule, the path for different countries should still be different. For example, if you have a sound expenditure rule, this would take into account, in my thinking, the potential growth level of a country. And therefore, immediately, the path that it would lead would be different per country. So I think, yes, to reach a sustainable fiscal outcome, different countries will take a very different route, but it should be and can be based on the same fiscal framework.
Xavier, would you like to add?
Yes, I completely agree. I don't think it truly matters to have a certain debt target or anything like that. I mean, as I said, debt sustainability is a directional concept. It means that somehow you're in a trajectory where debt is converging downwards if it comes from too high a level towards levels that everyone could feel comfortable with. But there is no need to have actually a single number or a single rule. You know, if you look at the the range of proposals that are circulating, I think it's pretty clear to me that the discussion is less about the design of the rule themselves than about the enforcement. And you have proposals that say, well, you should leave everything into national hands because, by the way, you have greater ownership at the national level and they're better able to define what can work best in their specific political context. Because again, this is enforcement that truly matters. I would agree completely with Jeroen that indeed you don't need the exact same rules. But there is a caveat to that, which is that you were talking earlier about institution buildings and so on and so forth. I mean, not all countries in the EU have the same institutional frameworks, you have the same institutional traditions. I have in mind certainly a number of countries, including the one we're in, which tend to rely on external anchors to gain credibility in their national frameworks. And for them, having a European backstop, so to speak, in terms of a fiscal framework is also extremely useful. So This is a complicated matter, but again, the bottom line is that, I mean, the devil really is not, in my view, in the specific design of the rule. It is in how we can make sure that we trust in them through some kind of credible enforcement mechanism. And we need that because this is the issue.
Sebastian, would you like also to say something on this?
So I think treating different countries just differently seems to me a big source of complexity and problems. But what is true is obviously countries start from very different debt levels. They also have very different growth rates. Some countries actually have quite different interest payments as well. So you put all of that together, and that's why it's hard to get a simple. I mean, we thought about it when we were writing the paper. Wouldn't it be just great if you could just write down in one equation a rule that would do everything? And as far as I can tell, that just doesn't exist. You need more parameters than that, which is maybe why you need different rule, more than one rule, or why you need certain sort of additional bits within the rule. And that's where this testing becomes very important, because you really have to look and make sure it looks okay for everyone. And that's quite hard to do. And you want a rule that is not too strict on some countries. You don't want a rule that would, if you followed it, absolutely punish very, very high debt countries in a way that's not credible, and that doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, you don't want to be too lenient on other countries who might not have such high debt, but should still be making some effort to reduce debt to a safer level. So that's why you really need to look at it in a lot of detail. And it's not having a conversation like this that you can really do that. You really need to test it and you need to look through the implications, right? And a rule that kind of looks the same can have massively different implications for two countries with the same debt level but have got different interest growth differentials, for example. So it's a tricky thing to do, and that's one of the things that needs to be worked out very carefully. And once you've done that, you can then go and set the expenditure rule that follows from it and have a similar framework that makes sense. And I think on the point of complexity, one thing that we felt a lot in our discussions around the network is you have some good complexity that you have to take into account the fact the world's a complicated place and different countries in different places, and you have bad complexity, and bad complexity is complexity that doesn't help, either because it creates sort of loopholes that people can exploit, or it just makes things more complicated for no real reason. And there's big parts of the rules where there's just a lot of detail and attempt to cover lots of contingencies, and just the cost benefit of that I think doesn't really make sense. I think you'd be better off with a slightly simpler view of what you're trying to do, and then in practice the IFIs can help, the Commission can look at it and hopefully make an objective assessment. But getting rid of that bad complexity I think should be the priority.
Thanks very much. Let me move to another question, which is actually is a point which was explicitly mentioned by Xavier. And the question is whether the speakers support the golden rule. I think Xavier was quite clear on this golden rule, either for instance, for green investment or for other kind of investment which could have an intergenerational impact. Who would you like to share his position on this point of golden rule?
Well, I think Xavier, you want to go first?
Oh no! It was just to clarify one thing. I mean, when I say protection from politicians, not from rules, I think that the overall composition of public spending is really a political choice. It's up to the elected policymakers to actually translate their political platform into some kind of financial priorities. It's up to them to prioritize, and if they cut investment to comply with the rule, this is the wrong thing to do, and an IFI could actually do something useful by flagging this. So now, if you want to enshrine investment protection in a rule, then I would combine a ceiling on total expenditure with a floor on investment, and that's it. I mean, at the end of the day, we care about that. We don't care about the color of expenditure. It could be blue, green, red. I don't care. The debt is all gray, and this is what you have to repay at the end of the day.
I completely agree. Thing is, as soon as we would open the door and say, well, let's keep investments or some investments or green investments outside of our fiscal framework, it's a can of worms. It's going to go everywhere, and it'll be extremely complex and very political to then decide what are the real green investments, what are the good investments. Yeah, I could give many examples of this. because it's an old discussion, of course. We've debated it very often, and it very quickly becomes very political because it's so complex to then distinguish the good investments and the not good investments. So.
Indeed, I mean, now we're speaking about green investment, but I've been around enough to remember a similar discussion maybe more than 10 years ago on investment for education or similar kind of things. So in a sense, this is really not completely new. The context has changed, but I think that the complexity remains. Sebastian, maybe your view on this?
So I think it was interesting talking to different members of the network. I think there's quite a range of views on this issue. I think the debate has shifted, I think, a little bit. Partly I think in the past the view was, well, there's a sort of theoretical argument for it, but in reality it's too complicated to implement. I think there are huge investment needs coming in many countries from climate, and that's a really big question that fiscal policy is going to have to look at. But I think, I think the message from the network contribution is that you have to do it very carefully and think about it very, design it very well if that's what you're going to do. I think there's a sort of view out there that you often get that public investment is a good thing. A demand has been kind of weak and productivity has been for weak. We need to do this investment for climate. Let's exclude it from the rules, and that's a good thing. But I think that view is woefully simplistic, and I think it has to be looked at very, very carefully, both in the practice and whether you want to do it at all. I think sometimes it's used as an excuse just to ease the stance. So it's like you can do what you did before, plus do all this public investment on top. That clearly doesn't make sense. You would have to, if you were going to treat investment separately, you'd have to recalibrate the whole rules. I think a big issue as well is the quality of public investment. I mean, we know very little about that. But it's a massive challenge, and there's I think in many countries there are lots of issues about how productive investment is, and the truth is we don't really know how productive it is, and it's very, very hard to assess. So I think really it needs a much deeper assessment than you can maybe easily capture in the rules. I think Xavier's idea of a floor, I think is actually, personally, I think it's not a bad one. I think a lot of the problem is that in bad times governments tend to slash public investment. And they do that because they think it's easy, but they're basically sacrificing the future. It's actually an issue. I mean, we had that in Ireland a couple of years ago. We actually told the government that though we mostly looked at the overall stance, we were going to make an exception this time, and we said public investment is too low. So it is a first order issue, but I think how you include it in the rules or whether you want to treat it separately is very complicated, and I think it doesn't fit into this narrative that this is just an obvious thing to do. So I think it's a very nuanced picture, whatever is done.
So can I ask maybe a follow-up question on this? I mean, and now under Next Generation EU, a lot of money will flow to countries, and in principle, this money should be largely used for green investment. One question I wonder is to what extent actually these resources would substitute for the need to have green investment at national level, so using national resources and having national debt. And the second question is to what extent, especially for countries which are going to receive substantial amount of money, for instance, Spain, but also some other small countries like Slovenia, for which the RRF basically is bringing in substantial share of GDP in terms of resources, can impact public finances. So in a sense, there will be some years during which public finances actually could be relieved. And then at some point, there may be a shock because these flows will finish, will be over. I mean, there is a planning. I mean, of course, countries can prepare to it, but this may have actually substantial impact both on public finances and on growth in terms of aggregate demand. So I'm sorry, I'm going a bit outside the scope, but I think this is actually quite relevant because this is something that is going to happen very soon, and I think needs to be taken into consideration. Anyone who has a view on this or comment?
I think it would be great if the national financial institutions would keep a close eye on these kind of effects. So does the additional European funding replace structural investments in the national budgets? Is the European money used for one-off investments, or is it in fact a structural issue that is being addressed? and what will happen once the European funds dry up again. So I think this is typically a topic where European policy and national budgets meet each other, and where the IFIs could keep a close watch.
I think that's exactly right. This is the kind of issue to answer Haroon's very good questions. You need to have a really good understanding of what's going on in the country, and I think that's something that the IFIs, in principle, should be able to do. And there was some discussion of bringing them, I think, a bit more into that discussion at EU level. I think in practice, not very much has happened. So I think countries haven't engaged very much with the IFIs, particularly in the countries that are most affected. But I know the IFIs in those countries are doing the best that they can. I think there's often actually a limited amount of information and transparency, which makes it difficult for the IFIs to do that. And I also think in some of these investment areas, there are areas that are a little bit beyond or the margins of the work that a lot of IFIs have done, really to evaluate public investment and whether it's going to have the desired benefits. So project by project, there are some IFIs that are geared up to do that, but most of them aren't. And it would be quite a big change to get into that kind of activity. And whether that's a good thing or not, it's a different question. But I think you're right that I think the IFIs, this is the sort of question where they can bring a lot of value added, and maybe they should be given a little bit more of a chance in terms of information and engagement to do that.
Xavier, would you like to comment?
Yes, maybe a point which is perhaps not directly related to the role of IFI, but this is about the nature of this RRF. I mean, it's been celebrated as a sort of surrogate central fiscal capacity that everybody has been dreaming about. At the end of the day, whether the money is channeled through the RRF or not, from an economic and financial point of view, it absolutely doesn't matter at all, because the ultimate backstop or the ultimate guarantee for any kind of public debt issued in the EU is the national tax basis. That's what it is. I mean, the EU has very, very, very little own resources. So now the real discussion, I think, should not be about whether we will have a cliff effect when the RRF dies. It's whether we want to continue with some kind of central allocation of resources for things that have obviously high externalities, like climate change related expenditure. I mean, isn't it what European Treasury should be doing? And if so, isn't it the reason why we should have own resources by the EU to fund all these different expenditures? I mean, there are obvious scale economies and externalities to internalize when it comes to climate change in Europe. And, it is about the fundamental debate there is really about the perpetuation of a central fiscal capacity that would continue this kind of investment. I mean, climate change is there to stay with us for quite some time, and certainly well beyond the time frame envisaged for the RRF. But, as my boss uses to say, it's a very political decision just to kick the can down the road. But, I think that's the real issue. I mean, what do we want to make of this RRF? And that's a very fundamental question in the institutional design of the EU.
Thanks very much. We are reaching the end. Sebastian, I would like to give you the floor for 1 minute, maybe to close.
Okay, so actually, I think it's been a really good discussion. So thank you, Cynthia, for doing such a good job of chairing it. Thanks. Actually, really excellent questions. It's a pity we didn't have time to answer all of them. And also actually thank you to Xavier and Haroon. I think there's a lot of commonality there. I think there's a lot of richness in that discussion. And hopefully this is a helpful contribute, both this discussion and hopefully the paper, which I'd encourage you to read. It's on our website and you have the link there. Hopefully this will be a useful contribution to the debate that goes ahead. And I guess I'm feeling optimistic in the run up to Christmas as well. So let's hope that some of this is taken on board and that we end up with a better fiscal framework than the one we started with. And I think there may be reasons to be optimistic as well. I think there has been some progress, and I think if you give the IFIs a chance, particularly if you give them the resources and the powers that they need, they can make quite a significant difference to the national debate. Actually, it just reminds me, Haroon was asking about, so within the IFI network, we obviously talk to each other, and that's one of the ways that we learn, but there's also a number of peer reviews have been done, not by the network, but typically involving network members. The Commission actually is funding some of those. We had one of those in Ireland earlier this year, so I don't want to blow my own trumpet too much, but it said that, you know, we made a significant contribution to the public finances in Ireland, and I think that's right. I think it wouldn't have happened had we not been set up, and we were partly set up through external pressure, partly through internal pressure as well. So I think IFIs can make a difference, and I think that's a message that I guess all three would agree with, and hopefully people will hear that message going forward. Thanks very much. Richard.
Just thank you all. This has been a very good webinar. Thank you, Jeroen, Xavier, for being in our panel and for raising the points and furthering the discussion. Sebastian for the presentation, and of course, Cynthia for moderating this. Thanks again for SEPS for all the work together with the network, and all the participants for engaging with us. And please do not hesitate to reach out to us and to SEPS with your feedback, your comments, your inputs. And this is for the network just one step on the road, hopefully indeed to an improved fiscal framework. So thank you all.
Many thanks, and apologies to those who raised questions which we didn't have the time to address. Many thanks, and have a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.